classroom management is king. Without it, you cannot implement a lesson effectively, and you're gonna have a classroom that you don't want to go to each day.
Why do we all have to be here?
The reality is this: teachers don't get fired because they don't have an effective lesson, or the lesson doesn't make standards, or testing is bad. Teachers get fired because of the lack of classroom control. So how do you obtain effective classroom discipline? Well, that is what this video is about. It starts with having clear expectations and realistic expectations as well. So here's what I mean by that. I go by something called the 10-80-10 rule. I mentioned this in some other videos. It goes like this. I heard this on a podcast. It goes like this, that in any organization, including a classroom, you're gonna have 10% of the students that are always on point. They're doing great, no problems. You can basically leave them alone and they will succeed. You're going to have 10% of the students that are always going to have some sort of disruptive behavior, right? The 10% of students that are going to be the students that you're going to go home frustrated with, right? And then you have 80% of students that are kind of in the middle. Now, those 80% of the students are going to go one way or the other, depending upon the culture of your classroom, depending upon how you deal with the other 10% will determine what happens with that 80%. So having a realistic expectations, knowing this, knowing that no matter what you do, there's always going to be a handful of students that are still going to give you some trouble, right? But knowing that if you have effective classroom management, effective classroom discipline, that 10% and that 80% are gonna be working with you versus against you. And then your energy can be focused on that remaining 10%. Now, the great news is this, that if you really have this down, that 10% sometimes shrinks down to only about 5%. So for a class of like my size, I have a class of 30, right? 10% is 3 students. I usually have about 3 students in my class that kind of give me a little bit of headache one way or the other. But when I'm on point and the classroom's going and we're all on the same page, usually that 3 students will kind of dwindle down to 1 student. Those 2 will kind of come on board with me. And then I'm usually only dealing with 1 student per class period. So that's the 10-80-10 rule. So if you have the right mindset going into it, knowing that you're not going to be able to take care of all the students. Not all the students are going to fall in line, but your goal is to get that 80% in the middle onto your side. So by having effective classroom management, you will do that. The second thing is this: you need to know what you expect from your students, and you need to communicate that with your students. And here's the last part, and most important part, you need to hold them accountable to that. So let's start with this: knowing your expectations. You know, when you first start teaching, that you don't realize is how many. I think about this. I had a student teacher with me last year, and as he's in the class teaching, I was just trying to keep track of all the things the teachers got to do. Just within the first 5 minutes of class, there's so many things you got to do. You got to make sure students have pencils, they're prepared. You got to make sure they're working on the work, they sit in the right seat. You got to deal with someone who has to go to the nurse, someone needs to make a phone call. You got to deal with attendance. You got a gazillion things going on. That's in just the first 5 minutes. So there's so many things as teachers we need to do. So a worthwhile thing is to sit down and think in a normal class period all the things that you're going to do. You know, all the things that could come up, and then you want to formulate in your mind expectations on each of those things. I'll give you an example. And in fact, I have a course on classroom management, and part of that course is this worksheet. So if you want to take that course, it's 100% free, and see what document I'm talking about, just click below. I think I'll leave the link below. Just click on that and we get you that course for free. But in that course and in this document, it takes a step by step. How do you want students to be the moment they walk into your classroom? How do you want students to be in the minutes of class? What do you want students to do when they're collecting papers, passing back papers? Well, how do you want students to respond to you? How do you want students to ask questions? It asks all those questions, because those are questions you need to ask yourself, and you need to have answers to those. Because if you don't have answers to those, when something like that comes up in your class, you're going to find yourself at a loss. So think through all possible scenarios that can happen in your class, all the things that come up in a normal class period, and what you want students to do during that time period. How do you want them to respond? And they need to communicate that to the students. And then here's the other part. You need to practice that with the students. I spent the first 3 weeks of my school practicing those routines, and those routines. And then the last part of it, and this is the most important part, you got to be consistent and hold them accountable. Consistent and hold them accountable. I think this is where most teachers fall off. This is because they get overwhelmed by the job of teaching that they're unable to keep up that pace. They're unable to be consistent all the way through. But you need to be consistent and you need to hold students accountable. And the third thing that's going to help you in having effective classroom discipline is this: progressive discipline. Now, let me explain. You got to hold kids accountable. See, the secret isn't this. The secret isn't the consequence itself, the magnitude of the consequence. That's not nearly as important as holding students accountable. You'll get better behavior from students if they know that they're going to get caught doing something versus the magnitude of the consequence. So that's where progressive discipline comes in. Let me kind of play this out for you to see how this goes. And once again, in my course, The Classroom Manager, I cover this in a lot more detail. But it goes something like this. Let's say there's a student in the back that is talking when they shouldn't be. I'm upstairs, I'm on the front of the classroom lecturing, and they're in the back talking. What I might do, we'll start off, I just might say their name. I'll say, John, hey man, up here, okay? So the consequence was me calling them out. That was it. That was the consequence, me calling them out. My goal isn't to punish. My goal isn't to make them feel bad. My goal is to alter their behavior, their negative behavior. And many times, just by me calling them out, we'll take care of the problem, whatever it is going on. All right, so that's like step number one. But then it progresses. So let's say John's back there 5 minutes later. I'm up there lecturing. He's back there talking again. I say, hey, John, what's going on, man? And then I'll put his name on the board under my little detention box that I have. So now John knows he has a detention. But my goal isn't to get John in trouble. My goal isn't to spend half an hour with John or John spend half an hour. My goal is just for him to know that I'm holding him accountable for his actions. And usually what will happen is later that class period, I'll come up to John, like when we're doing independent work. I'll say, John, man, I got your name up there for detention because, you're talking when you should, but what's that all about? Give him a second to explain, right? And I'll say, here, John, here's the deal, man. I don't want you to have a detention. I don't want to call home. I'll make you a deal. You just go the rest of the class period and we'll take away that detention. Does that sound fair to you? And he usually says yes. All right? Progressive discipline, right? It's not costing me more time after class and nothing else. And so you can kind of see, but the key is holding the student accountable. But let's say it happens the third time. I say, John, man, we already got your name up here for detention. I don't know what's going on, but see me after class. And then John will see me after class. And now after class, I might have another private conversation and say, John, what is going on, man? I gave you a chance and the 2 more, and you just seem to be out of sorts today. This is not how you normally are. What's going on? I'll give you a chance for John to explain. And I say, John, here's the deal. I can't have this behavior in my class because it's just too disruptive. Come tomorrow, I got to make sure we're on the same page. If you don't serve me. The idea behind the detention is this. If it's right after class, I'm only holding him for about 30 seconds. I don't want to do more than that because he has another class to go to. And don't do that because then you have problems with other teachers. But it's a quick conversation with the idea that, hey, John, don't do this again. Next time, it's going to be something more severe. All right, progressive. And so let's say the following day comes and John's talking again. I say, John, and I put his name up for the detention. I'll say, see me after class. And then either after class or during that class period, I'll say, John, man, we had problems yesterday and it's the same thing today. We got to give you a detention. Come see me during lunchtime. Come see me during lunchtime or after school, depending upon what you can or can't do with your school. And usually that detention at lunchtime might only be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but it's a chance for me and John to talk in a little more detail, slow it down, once again, holding him accountable. And I usually will have the conversation, hey, John, thanks for showing up for detention. Or I'll actually tell him, hey, John, if you don't show up for the 15-minute detention, I have to double that, all right? So that's a way of getting him there. So he shows up 15-minute detention. I say, hey, John, we have a conversation. I don't know what's going on, why you're acting this way. I tell you what, man, and fill out this reflection form, and we'll get you out here a little bit early, okay? But it gives me a chance to actually have a conversation with him. The key, once again, isn't the magnitude of the consequence, it's the accountability part. Now, if the behavior continues, and usually I'll leave that conversation, hey, John, if this happens again, I got to call home. We got to figure out a plan because it's getting out of control. And so after that, then I'll have a detention, maybe a phone call home. And then if it happens again, maybe, you see the progression. So ideally, ideally, once you got the 10-80-10 rule, 10-80-10 rule, I'm going to have about 3 students I'm going to have to do with this on a regular basis with, right? 3 students on a regular basis that I have to implement this with. If I went straight to the thing and said, hey, you got a half an hour detention with me at lunchtime, I lose all my lunchtime, right? So by doing progressive discipline, you're usually able to deal with those 1 to 3 students just by doing that. And then of course occasionally it may turn into phone calls home and a send it to the office, and that's okay. But the idea is you start small, you build upon it, and you just put enough pressure on there to alter the behavior. That is what you are looking for.